Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Once, when Jesus was praying alone with only his disciples near him, he asked them, "Who do the crowds say that I am?" They answered, "John the Baptist, but others, Elijah, and still others, that you are one of the ancient prophets come back to life." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered, "The Messiah of God." Jesus sternly ordered and commanded them not to tell anybody, saying, "The Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised." The Gospel inspired by God. I'm sure we're all old enough at this stage to realize that the three great questions that we are meant to answer during life are, who am I? Who is my neighbour? And what is my mission? And this is not just the work of philosophers or theologians. Every single one of us has to come up with really practical answers to these questions. Otherwise, the unexamined life is not worth living. So when you walk yourself through the life of Christ, you see that he's going through answering these three great questions. So I believe that he had the answer to the first question by about age 12, the question, who am I? There's this great story in Luke's Gospel in chapter 2 where at age 12 he's going down to Jerusalem with his parents, because anybody aged 12 and over had to go to Jerusalem on 2 occasions every year for big festivals. Now he's living way up in the north in Galilee, in Nazareth, so he has to schlep all the way down to Jerusalem, and it's a 3-day safari. And he's there during the festival, and then the family start going back home at the end. And they travel for 1 day, and they presume, his father and mother presume he's with his cousins. But when they camp for the night, there's no sign of him, and they're freaking out. So they have to go back down to Jerusalem, and they spend 3 days looking for him. And finally they find him in the temple, arguing and debating with the scholars. He's a 12-year-old kid, and he's arguing and debating with the scholars. So at that stage, I think, he'd figured out the answer to the first question, who am I? He understood who he was. Having got the answer to the first question, he spends the next 18 years figuring out the answer to the next 2 questions. And the next one is, who is my neighbour? And the best articulation of this is in another story that you find in Luke's Gospel. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. And the Good Samaritan is a very deep parable. You all know the basic outline. The basic outline is he's been interrogated at one stage by another group of scholars, and one of them says to him, when he'd asked him the question, what is the most important commandment of the law of all 613 precepts? And so Christ says, this is it. You must love the Lord your God with your whole heart and your whole soul and your whole mind. And as a bonus, I'm going to give you the answer to the second question, even though you didn't answer it. The second most important commandment is, you must love your neighbour as you love yourself. And so the guy comes back and says, yeah, but who is my neighbour? And Christ gives a response to this by telling a story. And he says, okay, you want to know who your neighbour is? A certain man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, a Jewish man. And he fell among robbers. He got mugged and left for half dead on the side of the road. And some hours later, one of the priests was going down from the temple down to Jericho as well, and he sees his fellow Jew lying half dead on the road, and he just passed by and couldn't be bothered. And some hours later, a Levite was going down. The Levites were the temple police. He's going down, he sees a fellow Jew lying at the side of the road, and he ignores him and keeps going. And some hours later, there was a Samaritan going down, and he saw this Jewish man, and he had pity on him, and he picked him up, put him on his own donkey, took him down to Jericho, looked after him for a few days, and then told the innkeeper, I've got business to attend to. Can you look after this guy, make sure he gets food or whatever? I'll be back in 3 or 4 days, and I'll pick up the tab. And then Christ says to the guy, who do you think was neighbour to the man who fell among thieves? Now, you need to know the backstory to this. The Samaritans and the Jews is like Muslims and Christians in the Middle East today. That's the sense of it. And the background is this. After the last 2 tribes of Israel had been deported in the year 589 BC, they're taken off into Babylon, and they're in Babylon for 70 years. But the Babylonians left a remnant in Israel as vine dressers to look after the fields. And this remnant intermarried with the Babylonian soldiers, and they become the Samaritans. So they're half-breeds. So when the Jews are released in 529 BC, the Persian Empire overthrows the Babylonian, and a remnant of the Jews come back into the land of Israel. Now only a tiny group of them actually came back, 24,000 we are told. The others opted to stay in Babylon. But they came back and they found these half-breeds, the intermingling between the people who were left behind, the vine dressers, and the Babylonian colonialists. Now when they came back, the first temple had been destroyed at this stage. The Samaritans offered to help them rebuild the temple, and the real full-blooded Jews wouldn't allow them to do it. So a tremendous animosity developed, and now the Samaritans started attacking their efforts to build the temple. Fast forward now 500 years, and there's 500 years of this conflict have gone on. So they're like Christians and Muslims in the Middle East today. That was the kind of the relationship they had. And here's Jesus Christ saying, you know, a Jewish man is beaten up, the priests ignore him, the Levites ignore him, and this Muslim guy comes along and takes pity on him. That is who my neighbor is. So it's a shock to his audience that the neighbor actually could be a Samaritan, and that the good guy in the story could be the Samaritan. So he's told them now who neighbor is. Neighbor is anybody, particularly anybody who's in need. It doesn't matter what their skin color is, what their sexual orientation is, what their religious affiliation is. Anybody who's in need is your neighbor. And then the answer to the third question, what is my mission? And they come to this, you know, once he's figured this answer out, he begins his public ministry. And it starts with an initiation ceremony. He's baptized by John in the Jordan. And then he withdraws into the desert as a final preparation, and he spends 40 days fasting and figuring out, okay, what's my shtick going to be? How am I going to go about this? So he spent, you know, his lifetime, 12 years figuring out the first question, 18 years figuring out the second question, and then the last 3 years of his life is dedicated to the mission. But everybody in his life has a different notion of who he's supposed to be. The religious authorities, you know, think he's a blasphemer. The Roman authorities think he's a threat to security. His disciples think that he's a meal ticket to fame. His family think he's crazy. They want to take him by force because they thought he'd gone mad. So everybody's got an agenda for Jesus. And it's the same with everybody else. Since the time of Jesus, every group of Christians, every generation of Christians has had a different identity for Jesus. So initially, he's the Messiah. Peter says, you are the Messiah. That's the first identification from outside. Very, very quickly, he'll become a king. As soon as Constantine makes Christianity the state religion of Rome, Jesus becomes a king. He's in fact the emperor. At some stage, Jesus is going to be made into a crusader. He'll march across Europe, killing, you know, Greek Orthodox, and then Jews, and then Muslims. He's become a crusader. A few years later, he'll be made an inquisitor. He'll pull people asunder, you know, limb from limb, because they don't believe in some kind of orthodoxy. He'll become a conquistador and go to South America and wipe out the population of Meso and South America. He'll become a liberation theologian. He'll become a revolutionary. He'll become a friend of the poor. He's anything people want to, you know, project upon him. So throughout Christian history, he's been made into different things. Now the same thing is true of every one of us. We have to figure out these same three questions. Who am I? Who is my neighbor? And what is my purpose? And like Jesus, everybody in your life is going to have an ID, a handy ID ready for you. Your parents are going to tell you who you're supposed to be. Your teachers are going to tell you who you're supposed to be. Your church is going to tell you who you're supposed to be. The politicians are going to tell you who you're supposed to be. The consumer people are going to tell you who you need to be and what you need to buy. So everybody has got an agenda for you. And in the midst of all that turmoil, like Jesus, you've got to figure out, who am I really? You know, and who is my neighbor really, and what is my purpose really? Every single one of us has to walk through these three pieces. So how do you come up with those kinds of questions? Now, most of us throughout Christian history have been told that Jesus is God and the rest of us are sinners. There's this great story in one of the Gnostic scriptures where Jesus is asking this same question of his disciples. Who, you know, do people say that I am? And he gets a bunch of answers, and he says, who do you think that I am? And one guy says, I think you're a sage. Somebody else thinks, I think you're an angel. And he says to Thomas, who do you say that I am? And Thomas makes the answer. He says, my lips cannot say what it is. And Jesus realizes Thomas is getting it at a level that the other guys haven't gotten it. And so he takes Thomas aside, and they have a conversation. And when the conversation is finished, they come back to the group, and the group said to Thomas, what did he tell you? And Thomas says, I can't say. If I tell you what happened, you'll take up stones and you want to kill me. So what happened over here that Thomas is afraid to report to them? And my theory is this: he brought Thomas aside and he said, okay, I understand you really get me the way other guys don't get me. What about you? Who are you? And he said, me? I'm Thomas. And Jesus says, no. Who are you? And Thomas gets, he says, I am the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jingo says, bingo. And they come back and they join the crowd, and the crowd says, what did he say to you? And Thomas says, I can't tell you. If I make the claim that I'm the Christ, the Son of God, you're going to take up stones and hit me. So he refuses to acknowledge it. So why is Christ saying that to Thomas? Because Thomas gets it at a level the other guys haven't gotten it. And it's the same answer that every single one of us can make. Who are you? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. You are the Christa, the daughter of the living Spirit. At your very, very core. I keep saying that everything that exists is simply God in drag. There is nothing except God. There's God who appears as an oak tree. There's God who appears as a mountain. There's God who appears as a human being. There is nothing except God. Everything is God. So when you really answer the question, when you ask yourself, who am I? You are God in human guise. You are God as Margie. You are God as Margaret. You are God as Nancy. So when you understand that, you recognize the God in everybody else. The difference between a megalomaniac and a mystic is that the megalomaniac thinks that he's God and nobody else is, and the mystic realizes that she's God and so is everybody else. And once you have understood that, you've understood who your neighbor is, and now the mission is very, very obvious. The mission is to help wake up the world to Christ consciousness. The early church is not this monolithic organization where everybody believes the very, very same thing and they're all on the same page. There are totally disparate groups of followers of Jesus, each with their own insights. There's a church under Magdalene, there's a church under Luke, there's a church under John, there's a church under Thomas, there's a church under Paul, there's a church under Peter, and they're all very, very different groups, and they're all kind of at loggerheads with each other. So the place where Thomas is called Doubting Thomas is in John's Gospel. There are two stories in John's Gospel where Thomas comes off very, very badly because there's tremendous, competition going on between these two churches, the Johannine church and the Thomistic church. And so in John's Gospel, Thomas comes out as Doubting Thomas. In other Gospels, in the Gnostic Gospel, Thomas comes out as the person with the real understanding of who Jesus is. Now, my own theory is that Thomas allegedly spent his time as a missionary in India. So he may well have come under kind of the influence of Advaita Vedanta, deep mystical Hinduism, where the search isn't for the God outside of us, but the search is for the God inside of us. And this was kind of anathema to the other churches. The other churches were convinced that it was belief in the Lord Jesus which saves us. And John's Gospel particularly is very strong in the notion that it is belief in Jesus, that makes you a Christian. And Thomas is saying, no, every one of us is divine. And so John's Gospel, or at least the followers of John, are vilifying Thomas and making him the Doubting Thomas. So whereas Thomas, in fact, may have had a much deeper understanding than the Johannine church did.
Yeah. So it was a little bit like politics.
It's politics from the word go. When you got two people in a room, you've got three opinions. You got another version of that conflict between Paul and James in their writings. And so Paul has written in one of his letters that it is faith in the Lord Jesus that saves us. And James, who is the brother of Jesus, says poppycock. James says, if you go into the synagogue and you see somebody who's naked and hungry and you say to them, Shalom Aleichem, peace be with you, what good is that? It is good works, feeding them and looking after them. So James and Paul are going at it about whether it's good works or it's faith in the Lord Jesus. In actual fact, when Luther in 1517 put his thesis up, he threw the Epistle of James out of the Bible. The Epistle of James was thrown out of the Bible for several years because of this. Because Luther believed, again, it wasn't good works that saved, because he was living at a time when the Catholic Church was promoting indulgences. These were the good works. You pay so much for the restoration of the Vatican, of the St. Peter's Basilica, and you get straight to heaven, or you spring somebody out of. So they were big into good works at the time, and Luther was objecting to that. So he threw the book of James out of the Bible for a period of time. The trick is, if you discover the God within, you realize it's the same God within everybody else. There is only one God. Yeah. But you don't have to, if you've understood that, you don't have to project out at all. It's like if you're visiting someplace and you hear all of a sudden, I hear an Irish accent, and I say, oh my God, there's another Irish person here. The Irishness connects us. I don't think I'm Irish, and he's Irish, and that separates us. The Irishness connects us. If you know that you're God, if you really know that you're God, you realize that everybody else is God as well, immediately. Otherwise, you're a megalomaniac. The difference between a megalomaniac and a mystic is the mystic understands I am God, and so is everybody else. The megalomaniac thinks I'm God, and that separates me from everybody else. So there's no self-concern involved in the mystic. The mystic is not self-concerned. The mystic is God-concerned, and therefore the mystic recognizes God in everything. So it's not an act of separation, it's an act of unification. And you can take any virtue, I guarantee you, any virtue is simply love in a different kind of situation. In some instances, love looks like compassion. In other instances, love looks like courage. In other instances, it looks like patience. In other instances, it looks like resilience. In other instances, it looks like forgiveness. Every virtue is just love in a different guise. And every vice is just fear in a different guise. So it's basically there's only love and fear. So that's from the book of Ecclesiastes. It's the book of Ecclesiastes, and I think it's misunderstood constantly. The writer of this is not advocating any of these things. He's not saying it's good to kill occasionally, it's good to tear down. What he's saying is, if you experience incarnation, there'll be a time when you'll experience murders happening. There'll be a time when you experience people building. There'll be a time, everything that exists, you'll experience it in your lifetime. So he's not advocating, okay, go out and kill now, because it's the season to go to war or whatever. He's not saying that. He's saying, once you volunteer for incarnation, there'll be a time when you'll experience all of these things. What are you going to do about them? So it's not advocating any of these things. It's saying, when you are a human being, you're going to experience these. How are you going to deal with it?
So it's a challenge.
It's a challenge. Yeah, it's a wake-up call.
It didn't come across to me.
No, the way it's presented. The way it's presented actually in the actual, even in the Bible itself, is presented. If you read it superficially, it comes across as an advocation. There's a time when you need to do this, and a time when you need to do that. And my sense is that it's not saying that. It's saying when you volunteer for incarnation, there'll be a time when you'll experience all of these different facets of incarnation. And the invitation is, okay, what are you going to do about it when you experience these various facets?